Hi everyone, welcome to the Dyslexia and Academic Success Back to School webinar series. This webinar we're going to be talking about working effectively with dyslexia, where there's going to be a real emphasis on dyslexic study skills for reading and writing particularly. The webinars are going to be co-hosted by me. I'm James Porter, I'm Community Manager here at the Tutor Crowd. I'll be the one asking questions. Much more importantly than me, though, are the two main presenters tonight, Stephen Milner and Patrick Wilson. Both presenters are dyslexics, so we're hoping for a really insightful and interactive webinar series from people who've dealt with dyslexia their whole life. Stephen is a published dyslexia author. He blogs at dyslexiawayofthinking.co.uk, and he also hosts the biggest dyslexia group on Facebook. Patrick's an ex-teacher and a dyslexia tutor, and he's now CEO of the Tutor Crowd. So just very quickly want to run through some housekeeping. Each webinar is 30 to 45 minutes long, plus 15 minutes Q&A at the end. If you've got any questions at all, you can chat to us using the GoToWebinar functionality, and we'll do our best to answer at the end of the session. Or you can tweet at us using the Dyslexia Back To School hashtag. Two final things: we will send you a recording at the end of the webinar, and we will put together an ebook with all the topics we've discussed at the end of the series. Okay, so this is of course week 2. This is about working effectively with your dyslexia. It's reading, writing and memorisation techniques for dyslexics. So I hope you've got your pen and papers ready, because it's going to be a full throttle webinar. Okay, Patrick, over to you. Let's get on with it.
Hi James, hi Steve. So first of all, we're going to talk about why writing is an issue for dyslexics. Now, writing is problematic for dyslexics. That's something that we went into detail in the last webinar, and what this webinar we're going to be talking about is practical ways that they can address this. Start off with, it's an issue. The key reason why writing is an issue for dyslexics is because of assessment. Assessment, 90% of the way a student will be assessed is through their written argument. With the dyslexics, they often write unclear written arguments with bad structure and grammar. Because they're mostly being assessed by the quality of their written work, this is what we would call a slightly unfair playing ground, because you have two bright individuals, one a dyslexic, one a non-dyslexic, and the non-dyslexic would be at a slight advantage because dyslexics have problems in writing, they tire easily. We need to address this. It's absolutely critical that we create some sort of learning strategy to deal with anything to do with the dyslexic writing, and that's one of the things that we're going to be talking about in this webinar. In terms of my advice on writing, there's a lot I've got to say. We've boiled it down into 3 different parts. There are other parts. The 3 parts that we're going to talk about today is looking at a study plan for writing, the 3-step process of writing, and a method that I developed for dyslexics called Talk to Write. There's other stuff that we need to look at also. For example, the webinar after, we're going to be talking about exam technique, and the one after that will be talking about how to deal with parents, and Stephen will be, I think, he's got a lot to say on both processes as today. What we're going to be talking about today are these 3 things, as well as looking at memory and reading also. Okay, so first of all, a study plan. Now, I don't know a student that doesn't think a study plan is an idea. This is not a new idea. I'm not presenting this as a new idea. How do you differentiate between different students? Me, for a dyslexic, for anyone, I don't think a study plan is a good idea. I think a study plan is absolutely critical. I think, it's slightly unclear about, how to do a study plan and so on. We've got blogs on study plans. If you've got any questions about study plans, write us at the end. You don't have to follow our study plan. A dyslexic does need a study plan. For example, if you imagine someone is training for a triathlon, they need a training plan. Now, someone who is training to improve their writing skills, they need a study plan. I'm going to talk about, examples of study plans. But if you think a study plan is a good idea, then you're not on the same page as me. What I hope, if you learn anything from this webinar, is that we will understand that a study plan is a critical aspect to improving your writing. Now, I'm just going to explain the basic components of the study plan. Essentially, I could talk an hour on just talking about study plans, but here are the critical aspects. First of all, set the date of an exam. Okay, so you find out when your exam is, whether it's in 2 months or 10 months, and then you should allocate time available. So I'm going to practice 2 hours a week. If your exam is in a week, maybe you want to be practicing 2 hours a day. Then you work out what subjects you're going to be working on. Maybe if you're doing A-levels, you've got 4 subjects. You're not so good on English, but you're pretty good on maths. So you're going to allocate more time to maths than English. Then you work out exactly what you need to know with the syllabus. I.e., so you look at something called a specification, which is part of an exam technique, which is part of the exam specification. And the syllabus will say, well, in your French GCSE, you need to do this and do that and do that. You need to have a look at exactly what you need to learn, and then you practice exam technique. We'll be talking a lot about exam technique in the next webinar. We're probably not going to go into that much detail in the beginning. The last part of the study plan is you manage it. Now, if you're an effective independent worker, then you can do that alone. I always think it's a good idea to do it with someone else. You can do it with a tutor, you can do it with a teacher, you can even do it with your parent, or you can do it with a friend. It's important that someone else sees the study plan to see that you're doing 2 hours on a Tuesday and an hour on a Wednesday. Now, I'm working very, very quickly through these topics, but if you want to know more about study plans, give us an email or have a look at one of our blogs. James, Stephen, how do study plans sound to you guys?
This sounded interesting to me. I'd like to know what the specific benefit for a dyslexic is of doing a study plan, do you think?
Well, I come from it from this perspective, that a dyslexic does have a slight disadvantage when they're coming to writing. However, you see a lot of the time dyslexics not improving in writing, but if they are studying writing in the right way, and we're going to look at that next, if they approach writing in the right way, they can improve, but it does take time, and so therefore they need to allocate time. They need to say, every Monday I'm going to be working on writing. Now, if they do that for a sustained period, and I've done this with dyslexics, I've done it that they're working on improving their writing in the right way, and they're doing it on a regular basis. As you can see, like in this, they've allocated time available, then they definitely improve. And you can get dyslexics writing beautifully. You can get dyslexics writing better than normal people because they put so much focus. They turn that weakness into a strength. Stephen, what are your thoughts on the issue?
I mean, with study plans, it's something which I never used. And looking back, that was really one of my biggest weaknesses, planning my revision and studies. I would say, looking back now, I think one of the biggest keys, especially for dyslexics, because they struggle with writing and they don't want to be reading a lot when they're producing or revising. I always say that they need to remember the facts of so they understand something for when they come and do the exam. So when my study plan used to be, and especially now in work, when I'm trying to remember things, is I try to produce notes, just a set of bullet points. So when I do when I'm revising, even though that's my approach to revising is just bullet point notes, I can then come back and read them pretty quickly. They go into my memory, and it's a simple approach. But definitely study plans, like you're saying, you need to know when you're going to revise. I know it's not easy because life dictates where you want to be when you want to be studying and when you want to have some fun. But definitely, I would say it's something which is definitely useful for dyslexics, especially.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. And just to clarify, Patrick, you think that it's important to have a study plan for an exam, but it's also important to put a study plan in place specifically for writing and improving your writing techniques.
Definitely, a dyslexic has good skills, and a dyslexic has areas that he or she will need to improve on. Typically, this is not the case for all dyslexics, and all dyslexics are different. They should get a skills plan. They should get a study plan. This stuff might sound complicated. If it does, give us an email about it. But they should get a study plan in place for improving their study skills, improving their reading skills, their writing skills, and so on.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. Okay, so now move on to learning. I think this is you again, Patrick.
Well, this is something, called learning as a three-step process, not necessarily an action that one would take. But what I think what people don't realise is that, learning is definitely a three-step process. We're talking about writing, but we could be talking about anything. We could be talking about learning how to climb a tree or swim or something like that. It doesn't really matter. The process is that you practice something, you get feedback from an expert, and then you take action, i.e. you practice again, listening to the feedback from the expert. These things sound quite obvious, but what's interesting to me is not looking how it goes right, but also interestingly how it goes wrong. So typically what would happen with a dyslexic or any student is that they'll practice writing. For example, they'll be practicing writing an essay or an exam. Then they get feedback. So they might get feedback from a tutor or a teacher or someone else. Now this is the critical point. Things go wrong at this point. Number one, the quality of the feedback is not clear enough. And number two, the individual has no curiosity about mistakes, and they don't actually sort of recognize that mistakes are a critical aspect of the learning process. So what would happen is in a normal scenario would be a kid would practice an essay, they would get a D, instructions wouldn't be clear, a bit of a grumpy note from the teacher, must improve the structure, a bit of a grumpy response from the student, obviously messed that one up, let's not really think about it. Now, if you think about what would happen in a perfect scenario, for the feedback to be optimal, the tutor or the teacher would give him not only a forensic understanding of exactly what went wrong, but also a step-by-step understanding of what to improve. And then on the flip side of that coin, the student would have to have some sort of learning philosophy, which a lot of students don't, that mistakes are great things to do, and then they want to make loads of mistakes, and they'll go, oh wow, this is really interesting. I've made a mistake, so this is a great opportunity for me to learn.
I think there's also something you've said before, Patrick, about feedback in an ideal world being in real time, because you don't want the student to get despondent after having put in an essay that they've worked really hard on and got a D or an E. Ideally, you want that feedback to come straight away so they can improve. Is that right?
Absolutely. And, in fact, we're going to talk about, that actually relates to the third thing that we're going to talk about, which is a methodology called talk to write. Now, typically what would happen, if you look at the normal process of what happens, is that a student does an essay or does some homework, gives it to the tutor, gives it to the teacher marks it, gives it back 2 or 3 weeks later on. Student by this point has forgotten it, but it's like, but then they get the poor mark, and all they feel is disappointment. There's not a lot of learning. However, if you could, what we do sometimes with our tutorial sessions, with our, a specific type of methodology that we use, is we have quick fire. So, you can write down the answer, and then the tutor says, actually, there's 6 marks available, and you only got 2 marks out of 6 because you didn't address this point, and you didn't evaluate, and you didn't, point to the date or something like that. And then the tutor will say, okay, and I'd like you to do it again. And that's not as disappointing, because, with a teacher doing it, it's slightly disappointing. But if you do it with the tutor, as long as you've instructed the tutor in the right way, they can say, okay, I've got this wrong, but I'm in a minute and a half time, I'm going to have it right. So it's a less sort of disappointing process.
Mm-hmm. And I think that demotivation is a really important problem. So if you can avoid the student getting demotivated, that's absolutely crucial, isn't it? Yeah,
I mean, it's demotivation is a problem, because as soon as and this happens with dyslexics, and they're if they are approaching things in the wrong way and no one's helping them, then their senses, they start to shut off their senses to the world, because everything becomes disappointing. And something happens in the subconscious mind is that if everything is becoming disappointing in the outside world, you kind of shut off your senses to the outside world, and that's a bad thing. You really want to be very, very alert. If you had a philosophy, and we're going to talk about this in a second, that mistakes are good, then that would, if and this is another thing that we focus on, that mistakes are great things to make, and it's absolutely critical for every dyslexic to go out there and make as many mistakes as possible. I want dyslexics to go and make mistakes and then really, learn from them and say, oh, okay, I want them to pore over every single mistake. So,
and how can I just butt in, Patrick?
Yeah. How
does a parent or a teacher create that environment for a student?
Well, they need. I mean, we'll be developing dyslexia training in the next few weeks, and part of that dyslexia training is endorsing a learning philosophy, and a critical aspect of the learning philosophy is that they think mistakes are fantastic. It's not like mistakes are great. I don't think oxygen is great. I think oxygen is critical for living. It's the same. I don't think mistakes is an important. I think mistakes are critical. I think an analysis of mistakes are critical for learning. How does that sound to you, Stephen?
I think dyslexics always make mistakes. One thing I definitely hate, and I do nowadays, is when someone gives me feedback. But what I like is, and I always tell dyslexics, that when you make a mistake, you need to learn from it, but in a positive style. So for teachers, when, like you were saying earlier on, for example, when a teacher gives feedback, it's normally criticism to the dyslexic. So it's the style of criticism that the teacher needs to give, which is a positive. I often find that dyslexics, and looking back at myself when I was a student, one of my weaknesses was when I made a mistake, I didn't know how to solve it. And when there was criticism, I didn't understand it. And so I often say to tutors, what you need to do is step in before they make the mistake. What I mean by this is, if you're going to ask a student, your class, for homework, I want you to produce I want you to produce some notes on a video or an article you're going to read. Okay, the first thing a dyslexic is going to do is, when they're going to read that article, they're going to forget most of what they're writing. So what the teacher should say is, okay, when they're saying what your homework is, explain how they need to do it. Teachers think, oh, it's just normal, a child will always know how to do it because they've been doing it in class. Well, no, they're failing in class already, so you need to give that experience of how to do the work. For example, study skills. And this goes back to, for example, study plans as well. So, for example, if you said to me, write some notes, I would say, the first thing I'd do when I'm reading, I would make some notes on what I was writing, also what I was reading, just some general little points. And then I always say bullet points, but I always write bullet points then from that. So it's like, from what Patrick was saying, yes, it's great to give feedback, but from a teaching point of view, I would also try to make it to solve the issue before it happens. And if you give feedback, try to give also examples, not just say this is how you do it by speaking, because dyslexic, like, oh, I don't even know how to do it in the first place. Give some examples on paper to say, oh, this is how it should look like. So dyslexic has an image of, oh, okay, that's how a report is done. Mm-hmm. This is how an essay should be written. But everyone has a different strategy, but
yeah,
it's always interesting to hear different people's responses.
I think both you and Patrick are coming at it from a very, very similar angle. So
yeah, I mean, just to briefly, to summarise, it's the action. Talking about, I think one of the things Stephen was just saying is that they need to be prepped. That's absolutely, the tutor or the teacher needs to feed back in the right way. Yes, they need, and that's absolutely critical. And that's one side of the coin. And the other side of the coin is that if this is one of the things that we're going to be, approaching in our, dyslexia training. If a dyslexic, and I've come across very bright and capable dyslexics who had the wrong learning philosophy that a criticism was a bad thing. If they endorse the learning philosophy that mistakes are good, then only that point then can they take the third step, which is the action, which is to say, oh, okay, this is an interesting mistake, I've made this mistake, and therefore let's change this action. And therefore, a lot of the time you can see we never get to 3, we never get to, because at the feedback point, people kind of shut their eyes like, oh, I don't want to hear this. And in fact, that's the thing that we really need to open our eyes to is, that, oh, okay. And we're going to get, one of the things I would say is, let's work with the dyslexia training thing that we're going to be creating in a few weeks. But also, even if you have a very critical teacher who is not aware of this, I think dyslexics would really benefit from, so they get, trashed in an essay. Teacher says, oh, you must do better, F minus. Go and talk to that. Say, okay, that's really interesting. Go and talk to that, grumpy old teacher and say, look, I'm not really clear about how can I do it in the future. And the teacher will go, okay, he's actually taking, from the teacher's perspective, he's probably, marked hundreds of scripts that day and he's in a bit of a grumpy mood. He might say, okay, this student's really making an effort, and then he might give you 5 minutes. That 5 minutes is critical.
Okay, thanks. I think that's some really really good advice there from both presenters. Okay, we're going to move on now, and we're going to talk about the talk to write methodology. Patrick, this is something that you've developed, I think.
Yes, it was. I've taught as a teacher, but also as a tutor. I've done both for my working life, and I've learned a lot from both. Sitting with a dyslexic, knowing that they understand the topic very well, and that they regularly don't create clear written arguments, sometimes with problems, structure, sometimes with spelling, sometimes with syntax, syntax, which is the order of words, very often with all three. It was interesting because I could talk to them and they were clear as as a non-dyslexic would be when they're talking about. In fact, dyslexics are brilliant talkers. They're very clear when they're talking, and when they would write, it would just be this word salad, and it was interesting to see the disparity. Now, if you thinking about, I think if anyone was here last webinar, that writing that was a multi-stage process, and you had to form the thought, then you had to organise the syntax of the thought, then you had to get it down on a piece of paper, and that's what was problematic for the dyslexic. I said, look, stop writing. Let's stop practicing writing. Let's stop writing and start talking. Okay, now I want you to start talking the essay. I would say I would like you to talk your way through the essay, but I'm going to stop you. I'm going to imagine every single word that you say is going to be marked like an examiner. So if you say things in the wrong way, I'm going to say, okay, start again. I'd like your introduction to be a bit more clear.
Okay, and would you advise a parent to do that with their student, or is that something that you think someone with experience needs to do? That's
something that we're working with a number of our tutors on. Again, this is something that I haven't heard of anyone else doing, but I know it works. It's worked with me, and it's also worked with a number of tutors. We're not all our tutors are doing it, so you should certainly talk to us about which ones to do it with. We've also got a blog on it explaining it. It's not something that we want to keep in. We'd like everyone to be in the country to be doing it, because we found that if you're doing it, it's as you were talking about earlier. You don't get that mock 2 weeks later on. I'll say, okay, James, I like that essay, but I want a stronger introduction, and I want more evaluation, and I want clear paragraphs. Like the way I get them to talk is say introduction. Fiscal policy is one of the most important policies in economics. Paragraph 1, state the argument. My argument is that fiscal policy is blah, blah, blah. So they not only, they're saying this is the first paragraph, this is the introduction, this is this part of this is the top part of the paragraph, this is the explain part of the paragraph, and so on.
So if I'm right, Patrick, although this methodology is really helpful because dyslexics tend to be more lucid and coherent when they speak rather than when they write, at the same time, it's about following the mark scheme in a certain way. So you've got to give feedback according to the mark scheme for that specific exam. Is that right?
Well, imagine the two scenarios. The first scenario is the dyslexic sort of wades his way, with a pen heavy in his hand. He's writing this, knowing he's going to get a bad mark for the exam. And you say to the dyslexic, look, I'm the examiner, but we're not going to do it with paper and ink. We're going to do it with you speaking, and I'm going to mark it. And you don't mark it the first time. You just say, look, okay, that was a great essay. Or I interrupt my students all the time. You interrupt them and say, okay, good intro, but I want more of this. Good intro, but you didn't actually cite the dates. And the mark scheme says you got to cite the dates, and you got to say you got to make reference to the text. So start again. That method is a quick fire method, and it's one that you can really improve the writing. Now, once you have the dyslexic perfectly talking essays, and you can get a dyslexic from a really poor essay at the beginning of the hour to a fantastic essay, at the end of the hour, it's actually a very small step, because once they've got that essay tight, they've got their essay technique tight, then they just write it, and they write a beautiful essay, because all the other work is done, and you're isolating the variables, and all they have to do is physically write it. So it's a much more effective technique than you do this juggling act of doing the writing and composing and syntax and structure and technique and all these things. You isolate the variables and you work on one variable, and you say, okay, you've got the introduction, great, let's work on the first paragraph. No, paragraph one's not working, start again. Paragraph's still not working, let's start again. You go again and again and again until they're talking beautiful essays. And therefore you can see real tangible process for the dyslexic. And you can see the difference in the dyslexic, because the dyslexic sees he's making progress. Like, a dyslexic will actually become very depressed if you're asking him to write essays again and again and again, because they don't feel they are improving in that short period of time.
Great, thanks Patrick. And if anyone's got any questions about that, because I think there's probably still some questions that are in my mind as well, feel free to get in contact and drop us a question in the GoToWebinar chat functionality as well. Okay, so we're going to move on now to personal problems with writing, and this is where Stephen comes into the webinar. Stephen, hope you're still there.
Hi, I'm still here.
Good stuff. Okay.
Okay, I'm just going to talk a bit about the talk to write, linking back to personal problems with writing. One thing that dyslexics often don't do when they're writing is they don't plan it. They often just go straight into it. And that's one of the biggest problems, because if you don't plan something, you can't, and you just go for it, your mind isn't focusing on the actual key information the person or the reader will need to read about. And I always say content is king rather than spelling and grammar. We know dyslexics will make issues with spelling and grammar, so what they do, what the big key is to put as much information, i.e. facts, the key facts on the paper. So when the reader reads, they can see, oh, okay, the grammar's not brilliant, the spelling's not brilliant, but they understand what they're supposed to be writing about. And that's what I think very much what Patrick was talking about. Now, I know as a dyslexic, when I used to write, I used to go straight into writing something and on paper, and the grammar would be all over the place because I'm trying to concentrate on the sentence at the same time trying to put the information on paper. My spelling used to be awful, and so I used to think, I knew if I was writing something on paper, I always had my problems. So one day my teacher realised that when I was on the computer, I was a lot better than when I was writing something. And to analyse that, the reason why I was better on a computer was because I was able to see my mistakes because it was clear on paper, on the computer screen. I was able to read better because the information was directly in front of me and my eye fatigue was less. And thirdly, I was able to come back to it. Now, being a dyslexic, we often think, let's just get this work over and done with. But that's the wrong strategy. I would advise parents, I know teachers, it's a bit difficult getting computers into the classroom, but I'd advise parents, even if you buy your child a cheap laptop computer, they can take it into class. You can get these as mini laptops as cheap as £150. And all you need is just the Word on it or one of these cheap programs. But the reason why I think computers are very good for dyslexics, for solving their problems, is they can plan it before they need to submit it. They can, when they're planning it, they can jot down set notes as well, and they can build a structure on the screen, so it's building a nice image. They can make it clear. They can also say, okay, look, my mind's gone now. I need 10, 20 minutes, or I want to come back to it later. And then when they come back to it, they can have they have a clear mind to come back to it. And then they can, when they're reading through it, they can make the corrections easier, and they can see the corrections are nice and tidy. Where if it's on paper, you're going to have scribble all over it. So I definitely think having a mini computer definitely helps dyslexics. I know that, for example, years and years ago when my teachers used to read my reports and they say, Steve, you've always got the facts, but your grammar's not great and your spelling's awful. Now, to solve these issues with dyslexics, I know it's not easy being dyslexic. Again, it's structure. Now, to go back what Patrick was saying about talk to write, it's a similar approach that I used to use. When I started, I worked out that if I rushed into a piece of work, I would make my mistakes. But if I stepped back and said, firstly, what I need to do is prepare what I'm going to write, I would get better marks. Now, ways you can prepare could just be, before you're writing a paragraph, what are the key information that you want to write? And I often found that if I wrote I said, okay, paragraph 1 I was going to write in history about the First World War, about the trenches, I would write a set of bullet points of what I wanted to write. But what I found was I was able to put these bullet points into a paragraph. Straight away, I had a structure. And that's definitely something which dyslexics need to teach themselves, is before they start to work on something, plan it. And then you often find that by planning it, you can piece together what you wanted to say and do. Can I ask Patrick how he might find solving writing issues, if he thinks I'm on the correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's what Stephen was talking about. It's a feedback. For me, the critical thing is getting feedback from a person. If with the right learning philosophy, with an understanding that you practice and you feedback and you take action again, and that you can talk it out, so you can isolate the variables, I think a dyslexic can write. I think it's important. Keep the faith. I think with the right methodology in terms of learning how to write, it is possible. It's also important to emphasize that the wrong learning methodology, and dyslexics will practice and practice and practice and will not improve very, very quickly. And that's why it can be quite a depressing and a demoralizing process of practicing writing in a certain way, because a lot of the time, non-dyslexic peers will not excel, but they will improve their writing over time in that circumstances, and a dyslexic will not. So I think for me, methodology would be an absolute critical issue.
Okay, thanks guys. Okay, so moving on now, I want to talk a bit about reading, I think.
Reading is that, I'm sure Stephen will agree that it's a balancing act with the reading, because on the one hand, you need to read. It's like writing. You need to read. It's again, there's a disadvantage for a dyslexic versus a dyslexic, but reading is, one of the critical, is critical. It's not the only way to learn. There are a lot of very bright people who are not good readers, but you need to achieve a basic level of reading. We've got a blog on negative and positive learning cycles with respect to reading. I think, again, that should be part of the study plan. I think, some sort of recognised reading should be part of the study plan. At the same time, you need to minimise, in some ways, the amount you read. If you are, for example, when I was at university and, or when I was doing A-levels, you get more than one textbook. And I was thinking, okay, well, which one should I read? Should I read the more complicated one or the simpler version? That's a balancing act. That's a difficult question. Tend to read, a more basic understanding of the text, because if you're reading all the time, it's an ineffective way for a dyslexic to learn. A dyslexic must have a very action-based learning approach. We've got some, another part of learning philosophy with dyslexics is that the passive will perish. And what I mean by that is that if you get a basic understanding of things, you're reading something, I get a basic understanding of that. That's one of the biggest dangers. And, a lot of what we talk about with dyslexic training is that there are dangers out there. There's dangers in terms of practicing writing the wrong way. There's dangers of reading in the wrong way. If you're not taking some sort of action when you're reading, for example, you're taking notes or you are trying to paraphrase it in your own words, then it's likely, because of a weaker memory for a dyslexic, and I say that myself, I've got a terrible memory, a weaker memory for a dyslexic, you're probably not going to be learning that much, so it must be action-based. The difference is with the dyslexic, if they take actions, they are more likely to remember it than if they are actually doing it, because if you do something through an action, it enters your memory in a different way.
Okay, that's really interesting. I definitely think that from personal experience, action-based learning helps me memorise much more effectively. Specifically in regards to reading, though, what are the advice you've got for dyslexics or parents of dyslexics about how to improve reading in general, though? What would you say to them?
Well, a number of different things. Talking about the negative and positive learning cycles, start reading something that you enjoy. We can go with a comic book, read something and read it regularly. That should be part of the study plan, even if it's just reading for fun, because that individual, and there's no shame, for 11-year-old reading at the level of a 9-year-old, and a lot of dyslexic 11-year-olds are below their reading age. There's no shame about that at all, but they need to be regularly reading. You can be producing. I'm not a fantastic reader, but the point is, I regularly read, and if they're not doing that, then that's an issue.
And I think you view the brain as like a muscle in this regard, Patrick.
Yes.
Isn't that right?
In the sense that it doesn't matter where you start, but if you start working that muscle on a regular basis, this is like the study plan also. Imagine how someone who is going to go from never having exercised to doing a triathlon or a marathon in a year's time. Now, everyone knows the answer to that. They have some sort of training program over that 12-month period. It's exactly the same with reading and the dyslexic. Now, what goes, interesting, how to do it right with the study plan, how does it go wrong? They get slightly demoralised by reading and they switch off and they stop practicing, and that is what goes wrong. That is something to avoid.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. One other thing on this slide really stuck out for me is the final sentence, which is, if you cannot differentiate between understanding and being able to replicate, then you are unlikely to be learning. I hope I'm speaking for people listening. Could you just drill into that a little bit?
That's a lot of, I think maybe listeners are trying to gauge my sort of general. A lot of the time I'm talking about dangers. It's really important to talk about dangers because there are a lot of cul-de-sacs or like dead ends in terms of learning. If you're not learning writing the right way, you might not be improving as a dyslexic. If you can't differentiate the difference between understanding and being able to replicate, you are unlikely to be learning. Now, what I mean by that, I'll probably talk in a bit more detail in terms of memory, but basically, students think that when they are understanding something, when they're reading it, they make the mistake that they're learning. Now, a lot of the time, they're learning, but they're learning at such a low level, and they need to be able to reproduce that, whether that's writing a note or saying it or something like that, unless they can, and that's an uncomfortable process for them. Reading is, even for dyslexic, it's a passive thing, so it's quite comfortable. But if they are replicating it, i.e. they are reproducing the information by writing it down, or by quietly saying it to the wall, oh, this book, you're looking away from the book, this book in biology says cell reproduction is based on this theory or something like that. Obviously you look a bit crazy, so hopefully you're doing it in your bedroom rather than when people are watching you. But you need to be doing something like that. You need to be taking some sort of action, because if you're not taking the action, then it's likely that you're not learning.
Okay. Okay, so moving on to reading problems from Stephen's perspective now. Stephen?
Hi again. Okay, we know that dyslexics have a problem reading, but what I think is important is for both non-dyslexics and dyslexics to understand the actual problems. Because if you understand the problem, you can put a structure behind it, so therefore you can help the issue. As you can see on the screen here, I've got some very strange diagrams with the word dyslexia. And the reason why I've got these is I want to show the non-dyslexics and the dyslexics actually what dyslexics see on paper. Now, this is just one word, but imagine this being a sentence and then 10 sentences within a page, or even 20 sentences. Now, some dyslexics find that words appear backwards on a page. Now, for me, being dyslexic and having screen fatigue, I don't directly see the word backward, but some dyslexics do. And imagine reading that. That causes great difficulty in reading. The next one down, you can see that the letters become very closer. Or some dyslexics see that the letters are moving around with the word on the paper. Some see that the next one down, some see that the words actually is moving around in like a circle. It's like it's vibrating. Other dyslexics say that they see that the word it's unclear. Some say that there's like a river going through a page. Now, for dyslexics, this is what is called eye fatigue. Now, eye fatigue basically means the message from the paper, which your eyes pick up from, then the message from your eyes gets sent to the brain, and the problem is your cone cells within the eyes are stressed. And when the cone cells in the eyes are stressed, they take more time to send the message to the brain. The brain itself it's getting not the full image of what you're reading. It tries to interpret what you're trying to read, and therefore it then sends a message to the other side of your brain saying, okay, I can see that maybe you're trying to read the word dyslexia, but the messages I'm getting is not fully focused, so therefore what I'm going to do as a brain will do is it will give you it will send a message to you saying, I'm going to try to put it together for you. And this is how the dyslexic sees when they're reading of the letters are moving around the paper, because you're trying the brain can't send messages to the eyes quick enough, and vice versa. Now, I hope I've explained that to you in a way that you can understand.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's not the easiest thing to explain. But eye fatigue, not all dyslexics have this, by the way. I would recommend that all parents, if your child does have low reading ability, it's either because they have eye fatigue or they often have problems with spelling, which can reduce reading ability. Obviously does. So I would recommend that all parents should visit your local optician or speak to your local dyslexia association or support group and find where you can find an optician for coloured lenses. Now, I'll explain why coloured lenses do help with dyslexia and reduces eye fatigue. Now, within the cone cells pick up colour. Now, red, green and blue. The colour red, green and blue make up the colour white. Okay, these are three colours which make every colour. But when a dyslexic is reading on white paper, the eyes have trouble sending messages to the brain. But with colour, if you find the correct colour individually for the dyslexic, you can increase their reading ability. Now, the reason for this is that when you're picking a colour, what you're looking for is a specific colour from all the colour spectrums of red, green and blue, which relaxes the cone cells. Okay, you do need to go and see a specialist for this. And what they'll do is when they find that from a group of colour reds, what they'll do, they'll try to look for a specific red which the eyes will turn around to the brain and say, I can read with this colour. And what you do the same with the green, and you do the same with the blue, and you get three colours. And you put these colours into which make it one colour, and that is the coloured lens that the dyslexic should be reading with.
And am I right? Sorry to interrupt, Stephen. Am I right in thinking that any specialist can work out these colours for a dyslexic, or does it need to be someone who a specific type of eye specialist?
Not all opticians have this service, so it's special. I would recommend you contacting your local dyslexic support group and asking for who they know, someone locally. You might have to travel an hour even to find, or 2 hours to find a local specialist. In the UK, I do know there's a good number of specialists.
Okay, I think we'll try and put a few links up to places where you can go, either local dyslexia associations or specific companies that can help. Then I think that would be very useful, wouldn't it?
One trick to find a specialist is ask another dyslexic parent. Now, personally, if you can't, you don't see a kid. If you're a parent, you don't know maybe the dyslexic parents are, or you don't know who they are. So a good way is to ask the child, is there a child in your class or in school who wears coloured lenses? Because the child will spot that kid a mile away.
Yeah.
And then the parent can find out who that child is, and therefore try to speak to the parents, because that child has then had a test and they can find. It's not easy finding these opticians, but it is very much worthwhile. Now, you might think, oh, why? I mean, research I've read about, I'm also trained to do the tests as well. And I've found that with a special colour, some dyslexics only improve with 10% reading ability. But quite a high percentage of dyslexics, around about 50%, increase their reading ability from above 20% up to 150%. Now, you don't know until you test the child or the dyslexic what their increase will be with a special colour. So that's why I always say, even if you travel an hour to get the test, it is so much worthwhile, because seeing the face of the dyslexic suddenly wearing these glasses or using this colour, they suddenly are able to read. And if you think about just having a 50% increase in your reading ability from 50 words, that takes it up to 75 words a minute, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
This is a great deal, because it means the dyslexic is picking up more information when they're reading, and therefore able to remember it more.
Yeah.
I know that the next slide, James, is going to be tips on memory, and I'm going to link that back to eye fatigue.
Okay.
Patrick, have you got any advice or information you'd like to give on reading problems?
Well, I think what everyone can see is that there's two very different approaches. What Stephen's talking about is that eye fatigue will lead to problems and possible ways that to deal with eye fatigue, like the coloured lenses. And my approach is that it's yes, it leads to tiring, and also writing can lead to tiring, and therefore I approach it in a different way. And I think they're both approaches. I don't think either are wrong. I think they're both important. I think it's important not only to address, how you can tire less, like, what Stephen's talking about, but also how you can look at other ways of learning.
Can I just say about, you mentioned about about light?
Yes.
About reading. Now, if you're a teacher or a parent, even a dyslexic, this is a good way to reduce eye fatigue. Sorry, you're talking about tiredness. Tiredness can come along with the light that we read with. Now, I would say to teachers, if you've got dyslexic, try to put them next to a window if you can. The reason is natural light does help a dyslexic read better. This is because if you use normally the bulbs in classrooms are not natural light, and therefore can cause tiredness. I know that you might say if you put a child who has struggles next to a window, they might spend more time looking out the window, but it does help with reading. Yeah. Also, when a child is doing homework, if their room is dark, try to put their desk next to a window.
Right.
This helps them increase their reading ability and concentration a lot easier.
Okay. Stephen, I'm getting a bit conscious of time now. I think we're going to have to wrap up reasonably soon. Got a few more slides. I think Patrick's just very quickly going to dash through how to memorise a piece of information.
So, yeah. For in terms of memorising a piece of information, there's a very, very simple model, and this is something that I've worked through with lots of students. You read it, and you could replace it reading it from listening to it. So I can say a sentence and someone else could repeat it back. You paraphrase, you cover up, you say it out loud, and you test if you've got it right. So maybe you read a sentence and then you look away and you try and talk it out, and then you look at the sentence again to see if you've got it right. That seems like an obvious model. I think everyone's quite familiar with that model. It's also important to emphasise something called duping, which is basically people pretending that they're doing it. People are uncomfortable with doing that, and it's important to state that because people don't like getting things wrong. I'm sure, I've explained this to students in the past, and they say, yes, I completely endorse this learning model. I think it's a fantastic idea. They don't do it alone because, again, they're uncomfortable with making mistakes, because they read it, and then a dyslexic will read it, and they'll try and repeat it, and their mind will go blank. And that's actually very, very panicking, because they don't actually know what's going on. I put forward with a dyslexic that they need to exercise that muscle. Now, what they'll do is they'll read something, they'll try and replicate it, and they can't. That's panicking because they go, I have no idea what's going on in my brain, but it feels like my brain is defective. It's not defective, but it does need practice. You need to try and do this. It probably will take someone starting off doing this 4 or 5 times to actually replicate that sentence. Over time, over months, over years, your recall function will get better. It's like what James was talking about with the muscle. You need to practice it, but you also need to be very, very prepared to make mistakes. And so when you cover it up and you try and recall it and your mind goes blank, you go, oh great, I've made another mistake. That's a critical part of the learning process.
Okay, thanks Patrick. One thing that sticks out for me on this slide is the apply, get it or don't get it. Can you just drill into that a little bit, please?
Well, when you're reading something, students, dyslexics, non-dyslexics, are basically, getting a good understanding of this. That smells trouble for me. Either you get it 100% or you don't get it. The reason being is because, again, you are getting in, there's a lot of false sense of security. There's a lot of danger in terms of the wrong learning methodology that you think you're learning and you're not. A lot of the time, dyslexics and non-dyslexics are reading something and they think they are learning something. Unless they get it 100%, unless every single word makes 100% sense, then you don't get it, and you need to read that sentence again. Even if that means if you're reading incredibly slowly, you need to read incredibly slowly. You need to read the sentence again and again and again until you get it 100%. Because if you are, getting that general sense, then you're in the vague land, and it's people that get into that sort of vague area, or I generally get it, that they get the terrible shock when they get their poor exam results because they don't know what went wrong. And it's a great shame when a student gets poor exam results and poor homework, they don't know what went wrong. This is about, this is what I'm talking about. There's lots of areas where people think that they're learning and then they're not actually learning, and they go, oh, I don't know. And they feel very depressed because they think, I must be, low, I must have low intelligence, I must be an incapable person, and so on. They're not, but they're not applying the right learning methodology.
Okay, thanks Patrick. And that brings us to the end of today's webinar.